Good morning and welcome to another Honey Ridge Locked Down in Psalms devotion. In the past weeks, we've witnessed the pain of the Black Lives Matter movement. Another example of one group of people experiencing the weight of another group who feel superior and acting prejudicially. We come this morning to a psalm that reaffirms God's love for all people. Any study of the Old Testament shows clearly that Israel had interpreted God's promise of blessing to Abram as creating an exclusive club to the exclusion of those who were different. God's purpose, however, was much broader than simply blessing his people. We talked about this in the devotion of Psalm 67. God's always had all of humanity on his salvation agenda. And despite Israelite exclusivity, God keeps injecting his broad grace into their lives. Joseph is set up by Pharaoh to save Israel. Moses is trained in the palace of Pharaoh and amongst the sheep of Jethro, the Midianite, before leading Israel. David's grandmother, Ruth, is a Moabite. Esther becomes the queen of Persia to save her people. Daniel and his friends serve the kings of Babylon with distinction and lead them to worship the God of Israel. Nehemiah receives the blessing of King Artaxerxes to rebuild Jerusalem. And throughout the Psalms, some incredible songs that affirm God's love for the peoples of the earth. Psalm 87 being one of the most direct, although somewhat obscure to the modern reader. So let's read Psalm 87. He has founded his city on the holy mountain. The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the other dwellings of Jacob. Glorious things are said of you, city of God. I will record Rahab and Babylon among those who acknowledge me. Philistia too, and Tyre along with Cush, and will say, this one was born in Zion. Indeed, of Zion it will be said, this one and that one were born in her, and the Most High himself will establish her. The Lord will write in the register of the peoples, this one was born in Zion. As they make music, they will sing, all my fountains are in you. This is a psalm filled with metaphor and poetic reference, and it's for this reason that the modern reader may struggle to grasp the full majesty of the psalm. The psalm starts out feeling like a celebration. God has founded his city on the holy mountain. The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. A key concept that runs throughout this psalm is that of Zion. At a literal level, Zion represents Jerusalem, the capital city of Israel. It was also the city that contained the temple of God, the physical place on earth that God had said he would make his dwelling place. As a result, Zion came to represent the very center of Jewish existence. They saw themselves as the people of Zion. Leaving your dwelling out in the countryside of Jacob, the father of the nation who was renamed Israel, and heading through the gates of Jerusalem was to embark on spiritual pilgrimage, to near the very presence of God. Every Israelite understood this and loved it. The psalmist goes on to say, glorious things are said of you, city of God. At this, the Jewish listener would smile and remember those trips to the city with its majestic walls and imposing temple. But the psalmist is on a different path. And he writes, I will record Rahab and Babylon among those who acknowledge me Philistia along with Cush. A quick pause here. Rahab there, as the modern reader, we tend to jump to thinking of the woman who helped the spies in Jericho. But the commentators are united in agreeing that this was probably a poetic reference to Egypt. So the verse reads more accurately for our ears, I will record Egypt and Babylon among those who acknowledge me. Philistia too, along with Cush. So what we have here is a list of some of Israel's worst enemies. What is the psalmist alluding to? Surely he cannot mean these enemies will worship God. Maybe he's prophesying a time when they'll be defeated and forced to acknowledge Israel's God. The next words would have taken the breath away from the Israelite reader. Blasphemous, traitorous are words that could have come to mind. Having just said that these four enemy peoples will be recorded as acknowledging God, the psalmist goes on to say, and this one was born in Zion. Born in Zion? What is he talking about? Egyptians and Babylons weren't born in Zion. Even worse, to be declared as born somewhere was to invoke birthrights. But the psalmist goes on to say, indeed of Zion it will be said, this one and that one were born in her, and the Most High himself will establish her. Establish Zion as this melting pot of all the nations. God seems to be welcoming all and sundry to share in the claim to be welcome in the presence of himself. Not only that, he seems to have a list that he's checking off. Verse 6, the Lord will write in the register of the peoples, this one was born in Zion. Just like the register at school where the teacher calls out her expected pupils to find out who might be absent, God seems to be keeping a register of the peoples. What peoples, you ask? Those scattered from the Tower of Babel. Those that God tells us in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, will be blessed through Abraham. So much for Jewish exclusivity and superiority. God seems to be willing to allow people on earth to be part of his people. And they're doing it joyfully. The psalm ends with the joyful declaration, as they, these peoples, make music, they will sing, all of my fountains are in you. Now you need to take out of your mind the picture of some fountain outside a government building. This is the Middle East. Fountains in the Middle East refer to the life-giving wells where water can be found in the desert. Life itself. And these nations are singing in worship to God that they recognize that their very existence is found in him whose dwelling place is Zion. This was God's purpose for Israel and remains his purpose for his people today. To be the inhabitants of his presence and to welcome in those who are not yet on the inside. The New Testament parallel to the psalm is found in Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. And John writes and says, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. And the tone would have been very similar to the end of our psalm. All my fountains are in you. This is the purpose of God throughout history. All people worshipping him. And the role of those who are already worshipping, to reach out to those who are not yet worshipping and to invite them in. And so as you go through your day to day, won't you consider the privilege of being one who already worships him? And ask yourself the question, what are you doing to help those who've never had the opportunity to worship him?